Welcome to this DW Business Special, looking at how China's rapid rise in the electric mobility market is shaking up the German car industry. To talk about this, I'm joined by Gregor Sebastian, analyst at the Mercator Institute for China Studies and the author of a report on this topic. Gregor, before we get into the nitty-gritty of this, maybe you give us some insight into just how dependent the German economy is on the automotive industry.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. Well, cars and also automotive parts are Germany's main export, and obviously Germany is a major export powerhouse, right? So vehicles, if you just look at the China trade, account for roughly 1/3. And maybe one important ingredient to not forget here is that the automotive sector is not just important for Germany, but it's a really European industry. So whatever happens to German car makers in Germany will also affect Slovakia, Poland, Hungary. So that really stretches across European economies as a whole.
OK, so given how important the car industry is to the German economy, it's no surprise that both companies and policymakers have been keeping a keen eye on China. It is, after all, the world's largest car market, and the developments there really have been dramatic. Let's take a look at the overall market share for both combustion engines and electric vehicles. And as we can see here, in recent years, German car makers have held onto about 1/5 of the market share in China. But look at this next line. This represents just Chinese electric car makers. Now, in the past year or two, they have well surpassed their German competitors. And now, if we zero in on just EVs, the difference is all the more stark. Chinese companies make up almost 2/3 of the market, with US and German car makers lagging far behind. A real reversal of fortunes for Germany's automotive industry in China. Gregor, how it is, and it's quite startling to see there. How did China manage to develop its electric car industry so fast?
So China had a lot of things going in its favor. First of all, it really grew very fast as an economy as a whole, right? So in 2009, it became the largest car market globally. So that's a massive market that's really important for companies to accumulate scale. And that is now helping companies like BYD to become competitive, not just in China, but globally. On top of that, you had a government that basically pressured foreign car makers to give up part of their know-how and technology to their Chinese counterparts. So foreign car makers like Volkswagen, like Ford, they had to enter into a joint venture with a Chinese car maker to produce for the Chinese market. And this kind of technology transfer hasn't helped China as much for combustion engine vehicles, but it still gave them the general kind of processes and equipment necessary to make EVs. And I think the third stage is really a massive amount of state support that the government has poured into the sector, knowing that in internal combustion engine vehicles, it's going to be really difficult to catch up with Japan, Germany, the US. But there was this other market segment, which is not only environmentally friendly, but also didn't have an incumbent that was occupying that market. So China really supported local players a lot over the past decade.
I want to talk about all of those factors more a little later. But for now, you mentioned that company BYD. It has cornered almost 1/3 of the electric car market in China. But there are several smaller Chinese players as well. What effect does this structure, I'm talking about one big national champion plus other smaller competing Chinese players, have on the EV market there?
So from the perspective of BYD, it's obviously great at the moment, right? They have the scale, their competitors are lagging behind. And to be honest, to effectively run a car plant, you want to produce at least something like 150,000, 200,000 units a year. And a lot of the Chinese competitors are struggling to do that at the moment. So for BYD, that's great. But from the perspective of Beijing, right, this is actually not ideal because they want to have a couple of brands, a couple of BYDs, if you will, that are globally competitive. So what Beijing wants to do is consolidate the market in some way. One way they're trying to do this is basically not handing out new production licenses. So if you're a kind of new company in the field, you see, oh, EV sales are going up like crazy. I want to jump on this trend. It's going to be quite difficult because you won't get the license to produce. So Beijing is really trying to force a consolidation in this market, but failing so far.
What about technological development, though? I'm talking things like batteries, self-driving cars, etc. How much is China betting on these fields?
A ton is the simple answer. So obviously batteries are the heart piece of electric vehicles. Depending on which vehicle you want to buy, they're worth 30 to 40% of the total vehicle value. And right, this is one of the key differentiators as well. If you want to buy a vehicle, how long is the range? How quickly can you charge the vehicle? And China has really cornered the kind of battery market globally. Just two companies, both Chinese, CATL and BYD, account for over 50% of global battery supply. So this is really something where Western players have really lost their stronghold. We had South Korean and Japanese companies that have slid down the ranking in recent years. In terms of other technologies, China is also jostling up there with the US and European companies, but is not quite there in this kind of pole position yet. But it really wants to get there in the coming years. And the Chinese government is betting hugely on autonomous vehicles going forward as well.
All right, and safe to say, German car makers have long benefited from the rapidly growing Chinese market, with the country traditionally a key source of profit for the likes of Volkswagen and BMW. Now, with increased competition from Chinese electric companies, European car makers have been ramping up their investment, pouring more than 6 billion euros into the Chinese car market last year alone. That makes the automotive industry by far the biggest source of European direct investment in China. Now, Gregor, I want to look more closely at the experience of German car makers in China. Is there anything resembling a level playing field there?
Not really, no. I mean, conditions are really vastly different for a Chinese investor in Germany and a German investor in China. So until quite recently, if you were a German car maker, you had no choice but to enter a joint venture with a Chinese state-owned enterprise. And this obviously is not hugely attractive for a German company. First of all, you lose a lot of autonomy, decision-making power, and potentially even IP. And additionally, what we currently see is Chinese EV makers pouring into the German or European market more widely. And if you buy a Chinese vehicle or Chinese-made vehicle here in Europe, they're eligible for subsidies, right? So you get the generic EV subsidy that European governments are currently handing out. This was not the case, though, on the reverse. So if a German car maker wanted to export an electric vehicle to China, the Chinese government would not have supported that purchase for the consumer with subsidies. So there's really two sides to the story, and China, to be quite frank, discriminated against foreign car makers here.
OK, and if we look at those figures as well, we can see that German car makers have already fallen way behind in EV sales, maybe for some of the reasons you mentioned. With this massive investment they're making, where are they seeing the untapped potential?
Well, they're really worried, to be honest. You've outlined previously that the China market has been a massive cash cow for them. They have, to some degree, become a bit dependent on the China revenue. And they want to retain their market share. So one solution to that issue is, rather than pulling out or just, muddling through, is doubling down on China and trying to regain that market share by bringing out better products and also just ramping up electric vehicle production. So a lot of these investments that we've been seeing go into new plants in China to build electric vehicles or to re-equip existing plants. And thirdly, German car makers now realize that, wait a minute, China is not just a market where we can sell our vehicle that we've designed in Wolfsburg or Stuttgart. Chinese consumers are now quite demanding when it comes to digital technology, so we need to invest more into local R&D.
Now, Gregor, in your report, you mentioned that German car makers and policymakers are no longer aligned on how to secure the industry. What did you mean by that?
So historically speaking, the foray of German car makers into China, the massive investments that we've seen over the last 2 decades have been supported by Berlin. There was a kind of automatic synergy that German policymakers saw in this China adventure of German car makers. They thought the additional profits that German car makers can amass in China, the economies of scale they're going to build up, are going to be beneficial, not just for the car makers, but for the German economy more widely. And to be quite honest, right, German car makers do repatriate some of the profits back to Germany. However, increasingly, a lot of the profits are now reinvested in China, especially into these new plants. And what we're also seeing is that German car makers want to do more R&D in China. And they want to create synergies on the ground, which could also mean that there's comparatively less R&D in Germany and more R&D in China, which could, in the long term, give China an innovation advantage, which is not in the German interest. Additionally, China is rapidly emerging as an EV export hub. And German car makers are following that trend. They're basically jumping on the bandwagon, and we now have some traditional brands like the Smart that is now produced in China for global markets, and thus also cutting into German production and German exports.
Let's focus now on Germany's largest car maker, Volkswagen, because it has recently announced a major restructuring plan, which includes a more than $120 billion investment in the electrification and digitalization of its cars. One of its goals, expanding sales of its ID family of battery electric cars in China. Let's take a listen to what VW's CEO Oliver Blume had to say on that.
The pace of electrification and digitalization in the Chinese market is impressive. Our response to this is the China 2030 vision for the Volkswagen Group. We have just defined the main cornerstones with our China team and the Group Board of Management at the Shanghai Motor Show. In essence, it is all about aligning our products even more closely with Chinese customers, accelerating the development of new technologies and exploiting more synergies.
Gregor, I want to ask you about that last part, exploiting more synergies. What does that mean in plain English?
Well, it basically means that Volkswagen wants to, as most companies do, achieve economies of scale. And it does not want to produce two completely different product families for the China market and the global market. But if we then follow Volkswagen's strategy more generally, that also means that there will be more development, more research and development in China for global markets. And this is kind of what I tried to explain earlier, is this R&D component that we increasingly see. So China is not just a sales market, it's an innovation hub for German car makers. And I think a key example would be batteries here. So Volkswagen wants to produce and develop batteries increasingly also in-house. But a key partner for that endeavor is a Chinese company, Goshen High-Tech. So Volkswagen really wants to exploit synergies from the China market for their global market.
Interesting stuff. Finally, I want to look ahead. In your report on this, you say that the German government should reconsider, and I'm quoting here, the logic of what has come to be called automotive foreign policy. Explain to me what you mean by that and how you think policy needs to change.
So previously, we had a lot of support coming from Berlin for German car makers. A couple of years back, China introduced an electric vehicle production quota. And at the time, German car makers were wholly unprepared for that. And it would have really hurt their bottom line in China. So we saw ministers traveling to China. There were a lot of meetings taking place, and the German government lobbied heavily on behalf of the car makers to delay the quota. And they were successful. They delayed it by a year. Additionally, investment in China was supported through some sort of insurance, basically an investment guarantee. What I'm pointing at here is that what we currently see does not seem very beneficial for the German economy as a whole. Car makers like Volkswagen are doubling down on the China market. And that's, in my view, quite a big bet. It might be successful, but ultimately it does not seem to benefit the German economy as a whole, because they're doing more locally, and not just for the China market, but also for global markets. So I think one thing that could be done is to create more transparency, how much R&D is actually done in China. Currently, there's a lack of data in that field. And secondly, and some of this has already been implemented since I wrote the report last year, we need to tweak these support mechanisms like investment guarantees going forward.
Okay, more transparency and some tweaks. Gregor Sebastian, we will have to leave it there. It's been a fascinating discussion. Thank you so much for coming on the show. And thanks to you all for watching. You can find a whole lot more from us on the DW News YouTube channel. Do join us again next time. Until then, from me and the team, it's goodbye and take care.